Hello and welcome. Join me as we take a look under the hood at the opening of Mozart's Haffner Symphony. If you're learning about writing for orchestra, then there's no better teacher than Mozart. His scores are transparent and well crafted, and have been admired round the world by many musicians, including that other great orchestrator, Tchaikovsky. Mozart wrote the Haffner Symphony in 1782. In fact, he started off by writing a serenade, which was going to be his second serenade for the Haffner family. We have a serenade called the Haffner Serenade, but it's not this music. This was a second go to help the Haffner family in a celebration, and Mozart, for some reason, I don't know if he didn't finish it or whether he got distracted, but anyway, the second Haffner Serenade didn't get written, and he decided to use the music that he'd written, or some of it, and turn it into a symphony. So that's how the Haffner Symphony came about. If you take a look at any piece of music for orchestra by Mozart, you'll see that about 90% of the time it's a piece of music for first violins. The rest of the strings might double, or they might provide a bit of harmony or some sort of support. And the woodwind also will provide a little bit of icing or double, but most of the time the music is for the first violins. What we're looking at here is the original manuscript for the Haffner Symphony. Mozart used the top stave to write the title of his new piece, and he began the music on the second stave, and as you can see, he began with the notes for the violins. So clearly, here the violins were uppermost in his thoughts when writing this music. So that's where we'll begin, as we take a look under the hood at the Haffner Symphony. We'll pull it to pieces, examine the details closely, and then reassemble the parts. Now, to my ears, the opening fanfare starts with an octave leap. This is the basic tune. Now, Mozart presumably thought to himself, how can I make this stand out? How can I make this impressive? It's pretty arresting as it stands, but for the first violins, he finesses it in three ways. First of all, it's almost as easy for those instruments to play a 2-octave leap as it is to play 1 octave. He then gives them a little more sparkle by adding some grace notes, allowing them to visit the intervening octave D. And finally, he worries about their bottom note. This is very low in the violin's register, and might not have stood out as much as Mozart wished. They do have an open D string, which they can use to play this note, and open strings are more piercing than stop notes. But to add to the weight of the sound, he instructs them to play this D on the G string as well, a string noted for its weightier sound. By placing a finger in the right place on the G string, the bow can be drawn across both strings simultaneously, producing the same note twice and giving a richer sound. That's what the two semibreves, or whole notes, side by side mean in the violin's first bar. The violas might have played the very opening phrase an octave lower, but Mozart prefers to keep them high and bright. There would only have been a handful in Mozart's orchestras, and their dark characteristic tone low down would be lost in this loud opening. The cellos cover the next octave down. For them, the top D is nice and high and bright. Mozart's scores commonly have the cellos and basses sharing the stave, with the understanding that the basses sound an octave lower. This is how the bass's music looks and sounds at concert pitch. And here's the whole body of the strings. The original serenade from which this symphony is derived was written for an orchestra whose wind section consisted of just a pair of oboes and a pair of bassoons. The oboes play an octave above the upper strings, though the highest notes in the oboe phrases are in unison with the violins on account of those 2-octave leaps. The bassoons play in unison with the cellos, which is not uncommon in orchestral music. When he came to revise this music, Mozart added a pair of flutes and a pair of clarinets to the first and last movements, to give a richer sound, which of course suits the style of the music very well. Together with the brass and drums that he uses here, this constitutes what we might consider to be a full orchestra for its time, and was used by Mozart only twice for his symphony writing, in this symphony and the Paris Symphony. Here are the strings and woodwind before we add the brass and drums. The horns, trumpets and drums are used here as noisemakers. In Mozart's day, the brass instruments were natural, that is to say, they just consisted of lengths of tubing. Notes could only be played by altering the pressure of the player's lips, and only a limited set of notes could be got out of these instruments. There were no valves to allow them to play chromatic scales. Here are the practical notes that a horn could play, written in the key of C. A horn in D playing this music would sound a minor seventh lower. The notes marked with a star would, in fact, have not sounded quite so good as we've just heard, because not all the notes played on a natural instrument are entirely in tune, though the player could adjust them slightly by placing their hand in the bell of the instrument. Mozart would have been well aware of the good notes and the less good notes, and also of the notes that were available to him. So what he wrote had to be an approximation to what the strings and woodwind were playing. So here the brass, and for that matter the drums, are just playing tonic and dominant notes, that is, Ds and As. And in the second half of the phrase they play Ds even when the rest of the orchestra are playing Bs. After the bold and loud opening, Mozart surprises us with a quiet answer, which he gives just to the first violins. In 1782, Mozart's first violin section may have consisted of as few as 6 instruments. This is punctuated by the other strings playing dominant 7th chords to begin with, before resolving with a perfect cadence. As before, the cellos are doubled by bassoons. Having lulled us with a quiet passage, Mozart jolts us back with the opening fanfare once again. Now, a lesser composer might have been tempted with a straight repeat of the opening bars, and certainly music from this period, the so-called classical period, has a simplicity of form. This could lead to music that was predictable and, frankly, boring. But Mozart and Haydn were constantly inventive and imaginative, and here Mozart shakes things up a bit. Firstly, he gives the opening theme to the cellos and basses. In fact, they begin by extending the note of that perfect cadence. Secondly, he adds the violas, but they begin a minim or half note behind before catching up. The first violins come 2 bars late to the party, making for a much more complicated and interesting texture. The second violins are now redeployed, providing a feverish tremolo, while the lower woodwind double the lower strings and the upper woodwind double the first violins. Brass and drums take turns to provide a jaunty rhythm, this time sticking to Ds. The tutti finishes in almost the same way as it did before, except the cellos and basses play an octave higher, giving a brighter, more piercing sound. Just as we're getting used to all these dotted rhythms, Mozart once again changes up a gear, this time introducing a section dominated by semiquavers or 16th notes. The violins take the lead. The rest of the orchestra try to catch up and play quavers or 8th notes, while the violins play 2 notes for everybody else's 1 note. Notice how the strings and woodwinds play high in their registers or in octaves, and see what Mozart does to accommodate the oboes, for whom the music begins a bit too high. Mozart gives us these 2 bars again without any variation. They pass by too frenetically for us to get bored, before everyone except the first violins drops away. This brief drop in sound and contrasting staccato articulation ushers in something new. At this point, Mozart has introduced most of the themes of the first subject, and what follows is the first of several transition sections. It was conventional in Mozart's day to begin modulating into a new key at this stage, usually the dominant key, and that's just what he does. The first violins play the most interesting element of the music, taking up the trills that we've heard before and running with them and introducing the G sharp that we'd expect if the music is to modulate from D major to A major. The music continues to fizz with another variation of long, short and dotted notes before subsiding at a forte piano, where the next transition section begins. You might think that all this excitement might be got by getting every other instrument in the orchestra to play the same thing, but of course that full orchestra sound would soon become stale. Much better to hive off different sections of the orchestra to fulfill different tasks, which will keep the texture interesting and varied. The lower strings largely keep up the flurry with semiquavers or busy quavers. For much of the time, the second violins chug along with tremolos, later joined by the violas. As before, Mozart allocates the bassoons to the doubling of the cellos. By contrast, the woodwind, together with the horns, largely content themselves with long-held notes, holding it all together and providing chords which signal the transition. They open this section with an E major chord. This is the secondary dominant of D major and helps Mozart establish the new key of this section, A major. The trumpets and drums provide power and rhythm. We hear the trumpets play a greater variety of notes than before, helping out the harmony when they can. Trumpets, drums and horns all can play A comfortably, so they can affirm that new key at the end of this section. It all fits together very well. By deploying different sections of the orchestra in different ways, Mozart maintains the interest, holds everything together, and keeps up the excitement by keeping things varied. Although he holds to conventions of modulation and works within the limitations and strengths of the different instrument groups, his feverish imagination keeps everything fresh and varied. I hope you've enjoyed this look under the hood of the opening bars of the Haffner Symphony. Be sure to check out a performance of this masterpiece, played by real instruments. They do a much better job than a computer. Here are 3 of my favourite performances that you can stream or hear on CD. And be sure to look out for the Haffner in-concert schedules for your area. It's great to support your local orchestra. Do feel free to comment and leave your thoughts about the Haffner Symphony. Please like this video if you found it interesting or useful, and be sure to share it with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next Explore Score episode, where we'll take a look under the hood of more great music. Thanks for watching.